various ways to exploit enterprise architects' features to manage architecture content. And of course, if there's additional follow-up questions, we'll try to handle that at the end of the session or offline. So the landing page that you see here in the example model may be recognizable to some of those on the call. Namely, this is a conceptual representation of the TOGAF architecture repository. It's actually more of a representation of a set of related enterprise repositories. So in addition to the architecture repository, which will be the focus for part of our presentation today, there's also other repositories outside of that, including a solutions repository and requirements repository. And we've actually extended the out-of-the-box model that TOGAF provides and added yet another repository that we find very frequently of interest to end users, and that's the operations repository, where we show runtime infrastructure components. But just to give people a little bit of context of kind of where this fits in the TOGAF, I just want to show you, again, out of the TOGAF standard, and we're taking a look at this in a product that APG's created called the APG TOGAF Process Library. And so this contains, again, all the content that's in TOGAF, but delivers it in a little bit more modern, partitioned fashion for consumption. And one of the nice things about it is that it can be nicely woven into Sparx Enterprise Architect for providing the kind of guidance that organizations and individuals need in practicing enterprise architecture in Enterprise Architect. So here we see again the source material, the architecture repository, solutions and requirements repository, and of course would refer you to the official standard for more details on this particular aspect of TOGAF. And again, if people have questions and more interest in the APG TOGAF process library, we're happy to tackle that offline. So the whole idea is that we're going to kind of walk through selected sets of content within different portions of these various repositories. And so let's start off at the top by taking a look at the development method. And so we're going to take a quick look at two different parts of the architecture metamodel. And so we'll take a look at the architecture development method to kind of start off. And so what we're seeing here is actually a representation of how we took the TOGAF standard, decompose it into a set of what are called method plugins. And this is something we did using Sparx Enterprise Architect and the SPEM MDG add-in, and that's the Systems and Software Process Engineering Metamodel, which is a domain-specific language that APG and IBM and other OMG members created a number of years ago, and it ultimately serves as the design specifications for how we built the resultant solution. So if we just kind of take a quick look, there's quite a bit of content here. So we're inside, again, the architecture metamodel, taking a look at the architecture development method, and in particular going again into the different method plugins that comprise the ADM lifecycle and other content that's in TOGAF. And we can dive in a little bit deeper and show a representation of what might be familiar to a number of people. This is again a SPEM representation of the ADM lifecycle, commonly called the crop circle. And this again has quite a bit of detailed information. And one of the major use cases for the APG TOGAF process libraries is able to take the out-of-the-box content that TOGAF provides and tailor it to end-user organization needs. And so one of APG's best practices is that you should model some of those tailoring decisions in Enterprise Architect to provide you the direction and context for doing your customization of TOGAF content for your specific needs. So now, after taking a quick look at the development method, which again in practice might include again some tailoring and adaptations to represent your specific requirements for doing enterprise architecture, now let's go take a quick look at the generic out-of-the-box architecture content metamodel. And so here we have, if we take a quick look, this is again part of the architecture content metamodel. We have a set of stakeholders' concerns and viewpoints, and we'll take a closer look at that a little bit later in the demo in the context of a very tailored meta model for an example end-user organization. And what we're trying to show here is that this metamodel is basically dependent on the stakeholders and their concerns and the resultant viewpoints that we're going to use to view into the model, but it's also based on the TOGAF-9 architecture content metamodel, which we'll go take a quick look at as well. So again, sorry if this is perhaps a little hard to read online, a lot of content on this particular diagram, but again, while this is not the source content out of the official TOGAF standard, this is our representation of actually having built a model of it. So this is what's called the core content metamodel. There is a number of additional extensions that TOGAF describes, such as governance, infrastructure consolidation, process modeling, that may add additional elements to this, but again, as a part of trying to jumpstart the tailoring exercises for an end-user organization, again, this is another asset that's provided to help end users figure out, what language do we want to use to describe the architecture landscape. And that's ultimately what the content metamodel is, its primary function. And as many of you folks probably know, we get into a lot of trouble in delivery projects because we don't understand the language that we're using. We use the same word for two different things or two different words for the same thing. So the primary use of this content metamodel is to converge on a set of definitions of the things that exist in our enterprise that we need to manage and enterprise architect. We consider this, ultimately to be a conceptual model, not to be taken too literally, but again, to get a jump start on how we actually want to tailor our architecture landscape, and then subsequently how we're going to implement that in a tool like Sparx Enterprise Architect. So that's just a little bit about the architecture metamodel portion of the architecture repository. So now let's go take a quick look at some of the stuff in the reference library. So we're going to start off by taking a quick look at what we might bring to bear for reference models. And so here we've partitioned the notion that we have a number of different kinds of reference models. We have performance reference models, business reference models, service reference models, data and technology reference models. One of the things that we find very useful, even though we're not a government organization and many of our clients are not government agencies, is the Federal Enterprise Architecture for the United States government provides a good set of reference models that are a good place to start, particularly from an example perspective. Things that tend to be pertinent to a lot of different kinds of end-user organizations are, in particular, its service reference model and its technology reference model. But we'll also take a quick look at some of the reference models that TOGAF provides, namely the technology reference model, but there's also an additional one that TOGAF represents as a common systems architecture called the Integrated Information Infrastructure Reference Model, or IIRM. So we'll take a quick look at the TRM that TOGAF provides. And so this is just a representation of the classification scheme that TOGAF suggests as, again, a starting point for what is called a foundation architecture. And so here we see that there are two different kinds of applications, infrastructure and business applications. Those things rest on top of what's called an application platform interface. But the real focus of most technology reference models is some sort of taxonomy or hierarchy for categorizing architecture standards as well as standard technology products, both of which we'll take a look at shortly. An example of another kind of reference model that's pertinent to APG is called the C-Core. This is a reference model focused on customer chain operations, as opposed to, and this is from the Supply Chain Council. They're most notably recognized for their supply chain reference models, SCORE, but they've got two additional ones that have to do with, again, customer relationship management and sales, as well as how we can design new products. So again, this is a reference model that's pertinent to APG in particular, an enterprise architecture initiative that we'll be taking a closer look at in a little bit about uplifting APG's customer relationship management capability. Then we've got the viewpoint library. So the viewpoint library is, again, another something that TOGAF provides out of the box. Again, here is the actual graphic that's in the underlying standard. And we can go again for people that want more information about what this looks like and how you might be able to find out more information about these different architecture viewpoints. Would refer you to the architecture content portion of the specification that again has this description and graphic that shows the overall set of architecture viewpoints that you might want to select from when you're doing architecture work. But then one of the nice things is that there is a description of each one of these things in the standard that you can go take a look at to get, again, a better sense of the purpose of a particular architecture viewpoint, some of the key stakeholders, and what kind of elements within the content meta model might be pertinent to your stakeholders. And so what we've done in this out-of-the-box model is that we've actually, captured all of the architecture viewpoints as first-class elements within the repository. And I'm going to just do a real quick demonstration of how we can visualize what those content is by using what's called the package browser within Enterprise Architect. And this is basically a feature that you can exploit anywhere within your model to basically view the contents and hierarchy of what's in a particular package and the elements that are within those packages. One of the nice things about the package browser, as well as the model search capability that I'll also be showing a little bit later, is that not only can we look at this information, we can actually edit it. So we can, we find a lot of end users like this feature of Enterprise Architect in particular because it kind of emulates the more mass update features that perhaps we're accustomed to in using in a desktop productivity tool like Microsoft Excel. All right, so now let's go take a look at technology standards. So we're going to go into the standards information base. And some of you might know that if you're bringing some TOGAF or enterprise architecture experience to the table here, that there are, TOGAF talks about there being two primary sets of content that we tend to be interested in architecture projects and the resultant solution delivery projects. And those are called architecture building blocks and solution building blocks. What we find in practice is that most organizations, particularly those that are trying to move up the maturity scale, is they really don't formally manage architecture building blocks, which ultimately are supposed to be standards, where we see most organizations start when they're doing enterprise architecture management, tend to be focusing a lot on solution building blocks, namely what are the applications that we have in place, what's their disposition and information about them, and we'll be taking a closer look at that shortly as well as what are our standard technology products. But there's a big difference between, again, architecture standards, which TOGAF describes, again, as specifications that describe the requirements that solution building blocks have to implement, and a set of actual products that we have within our organization that are the implementation of those standards. So we're going to start off by taking a quick look at technology standards. And so we saw, a little view of this just moments ago when we took a look at the technical or technology reference model detailed graphic. Now we're actually going to go take a look at the underlying content in what's called the standards information base. And so the standards information base, again, is trying to use the technology reference model as the categorization scheme. So the whole idea is that as it relates to technology standards, there are things around software engineering, transaction processing, location and directory, so on and so forth. And so if we just go take a quick look, we have, a whole bunch of content here in the project browser. But one of the things that we found very useful is being able to visualize this content in different ways. And so one of the things that I want to quickly demonstrate is how we can take this hierarchical content that you're seeing in the project browser and render that in a diagram. And so to do this, I'm going to execute a special script that we've created, and this is, for whatever it's worth, we could kind of consider it a technical preview of a solution that we're going to be delivering for Enterprise Architect later in 2014 that is going to be more of a packaged implementation that we're going to be making available to the user community. So I'm going to go ahead and create what we call a nested hierarchy diagram. And what this is doing is this is actually going through the hierarchy that you see in the project browser, creating elements on the diagram. And these elements, just for people that are also bringing enterprise architect experience to the table, these are not the same elements that we're actually seeing in the browser. So these are what we consider to be diagram objects that are related to model objects, but they're actually physically distinct. And that gives us some flexibility in being able to do this kind of nested boxing. And again, to try to show those hierarchical relationships. But what I want to do now is that now that I've created this viewpoint, I'm going to apply a heat map to this, which is basically another capability that we're going to be releasing that allows us to use particular things on the diagram to update the status or to render graphically aspects of the diagram based on the value of a particular attribute. So this is a very typical, kind of usage scenario that we see with enterprise architecture tools that, hey, I want to be able to capture all this content, but I need to have flexible ways of visualizing this. And one of the things that TOGAF describes is that whatever architecture content we're trying to manage, we should expect to be able to at least exploit that in 3 different forms. Graphical forms, which we're seeing here, and then again, using color coding and other indicators to demonstrate some aspect of an architectural property, but also being able to express stuff in what TOGAF calls catalogs or tabular reports, as well as traceability matrices. So now let's go take a quick look at some business architecture standards. Of course, business architecture is something that is of great interest to many end-user organizations in 2014 and beyond. And of course, from an enterprise architecture perspective, we really look at the addition of business architecture really provides the context that I think we've been looking for in IT for quite some time. Namely, if the business really doesn't understand itself, it's not a surprise that we run into challenges in enterprise architecture and solution delivery when we're trying to bring best practices and solutions to fulfilling those business stakeholder needs. So we're going to take just a quick look at a couple of aspects of business architecture, and the content that we're seeing here, because it's in the standards information base. This represents enterprise-sanctioned reusable content. And we'll take a look in a little bit about how this content might end up here. But the whole idea is that as the result of doing a number of enterprise architecture and solution delivery projects, we've incrementally started to cover aspects of APG's business domain that are of relevance to some of our strategic initiatives. So here we've got, again, an example set of some business fact models, some business process models, service models, rules, things around our business structure and our business functions. So we're going to start off by just taking a quick look at the kind of information that might be in what we call a business fact model. And we get our context for building the business fact model from another OMG specification called SBVR, the Semantics of Business Vocabulary and Business Rules. And that is, again, a wonderful set of best practices with a great set of examples on how we need to think about describing the vocabulary and terminology that the business uses to describe itself, and then subsequently how we can use that vocabulary to express different kinds of rules. And so here we've got, again, different business domains: event management, sales, instructor management, service, contact management, configuration management, so on and so forth. And again, this is something that's, again, within the business architecture standards of the standards information base. And let's go take a look at a more specific set of examples, namely how we've represented it at a conceptual level. And this really consider this either probably information architecture, the first-class business entities that are pertinent to how APG manages our sales processes and all things related to that. So here we can see, first-class elements like prospects, opportunities, proposals, requests for proposals, contacts, organizations, engagements, and again, the relationships amongst them, as well as definitions and potential metadata attributes about them. In addition to business facts and business vocabulary, of course, we've got the notion of being able to represent business processes. And so this diagram here is really a very high-level process map that's showing how a bunch of processes interact with one another based on this really being a collaboration between three different participants. The practitioner who is interested in, for example, receiving training or registering for an event, clients that support that through special requests and potentially payment for for-profit activities, and then how APG in the middle fulfills those things by a set of message exchanges between these pools, and again the set of processes, parallel processes, and sequential processes that we use to pull this all together, again pulling in the certification authorities such as the Open Group or the OMG if individuals are indeed looking for to receive certification. One of the other nice things about BPMN 2.0, which is what we're showing an example of this here, is the ability to take some of the complexity that we saw on the previous diagram and abstract it into what's called a choreography. And this is basically trying to, this is representing very similar content to what we saw particularly at the top part of the preceding diagram, where we're showing again these choreographies that involve two or more participants and some of the key messages that are inputs and outputs and how these choreographies worked with one another in the context of the overall process flow. Next, let's go take a look at some things in the solutions repository. So here we're going to go take a quick look at some example solution building blocks. And so, and while we're here, we'll also take a quick look at some stuff that would also be in the operations repository, i.e. Infrastructure components. But just to set the context, let's go take a quick look at a detailed model of the kind of information that we're keeping track of. And so this is, again, a derivation and an extension of the TOGAF architecture content metamodel. As you might guess from this diagram, we're certainly focusing on application portfolio management is the primary outcome of this particular implementation. So there's a bunch of attributes that we're keeping track of about application components, lots of relationships. So you'll notice there's a number of relationships between application component and technology component, as well as things in the business architecture like functions and processes, what organization units are related to it, as well as projects that are touching that particular application, and that's something we'll take a look at a little bit later as it relates to the overall project portfolio. So if we take a quick look here, let me just call up the tag values window, and then the relationships view, so we can see some more additional content. Let's go take a quick look at a example technology component. And according to TOGAF, these would be what we call physical application components. And so here we've got one called Active Directory. And what we can see is there's a bunch of attributes that in this particular case aren't particularly well populated. For this example, we'll see a better example of that for an application component. But we can see down here in the relationships window one of the features of how we implement this in Sparx. And just FYI, what we did is we took that detailed meta model that we previously saw, and then we implemented it as a set of UML profiles and then packaged it up in what Sparx calls an MDG technology, which is the best practice for packaging that content and deploying it to model users. And so here we can see that this particular technology component is used as a security service by a number of different applications, for example. Now let's go take a quick look at an example application component. And so here we see some more detailed information where we're taking a look at a particular application component is being sustained by a particular organization unit. It's owned by a particular organization unit, has primary support from a particular individual, is implemented on a set of technology components and deployed on a set of infrastructure components. And one of the things that we can do by creating a custom model search is we can actually, again, create an application portfolio report that we can use to, again, examine more specific content. So, of course, whenever we pick one of these elements here, we can see all of the related information down at the bottom. And then the ability to then visualize this content on a particular diagram. So this is one of the nice things, is that, you know, because these are all first-class relationships, I can put a particular element on a diagram and then right mouse click over it and say insert related elements, and Sparx will go out and find all elements that are physically related per relationships. Of course, we can filter this in various ways. And then just to give it a little bit of a better perspective, let's go ahead and reorganize that a little bit. And so here we see the idea that, again, not only can we visualize this content in reports and in the relationships view, we can actually explicitly look at this stuff in a diagram. And as a part of the MDG technology that we created, we can actually change these relationships, delete, add new elements. As you can see, we can add application components, org units, projects, people, actors, and then again a various set of relationships amongst them. All right, and then to finish this up, let's take a quick look at the project portfolio. And so this is where we would expect to see enterprise architecture keeping track of the projects that are in flight, and this would include both enterprise architecture projects and solution delivery projects. Again, this is an EA project, and so what we're trying to show here is that the CRM initiative has an end date and a start date, and so on and so forth, so there's some metadata about that, but we're trying to show the impact that that project has on our enterprise architecture. So we can see the organization units that are going to be impacted by this project, the application components that are going to be impacted by this project, and then the associated business functions. And then real briefly, since we're getting close to the end of our time, I want to just give you a quick look at what this information might look like in as it relates to running an architecture project. So if we take a quick look, where are we at within the repository? We've created, again, two special models at the bottom of the browser, one for architecture projects, which are those that are going to follow the architecture development method, and then solution delivery projects, which are, in the case of EA-driven transformation, are going to come out of having done the ADM through phases E and F. So let's just take a quick look at some of the ways, content that we can keep track of about a architecture project, including, you know, the ability to use the built-in rich text editor to actually capture the architecture vision and then get some of the content that's in that architecture vision into the tool, in this particular case, a set of business goals and business objectives. Let's go take a quick look at one of our best practices as well about how we try to understand who our stakeholders are and what they care about. So this is a particular diagram that we've created based on ISO IEC 42010, the International Standard for Architecture Descriptions, where, you know, before we start, you know, modeling stuff just because we can, we really want to take that step back and talk about, you know, who are we modeling for, you know, what concerns do they have, and then what viewpoint are we going to use to demonstrate their concerns have been addressed, and then how we're going to use that as a view in our particular project models, and that's actually going to be the content that is going to be shared with end users in the project. One of the things that we're also supposed to do in the architecture vision phase is describe a baseline high-level architecture. So here we're showing, again, for the APG CRM project, the business functions, data entities, applications, and technology components that represent the current state, and then a speculative view of what things might look like in the future state. And so the big difference here, as you can see, we've color-coded different elements, again, based on the disposition status, and you know, shifted around some of the lines to try to represent that we're sharing more information more effectively than we were in the past. One of the things that is nice to be able to do, and this is, again, a great capability that Sparx offers, is if whenever we have elements on a diagram and explicit relationships, we can visualize that in a relationship matrix, and if we manipulate the relationships in this matrix, they'll automatically be updated in the repository on resultant diagrams. And then to kind of wrap things up real quick, the last thing that I wanted to show, since really in phases B, C, and D, what you're doing is, again, a lot more of that architectural modeling in the different domains, and so we've seen some examples of that. The whole idea is that once the project is done, we'll then need to talk about how we promote that content out of the enterprise architecture space into the EA project space into the enterprise architecture repository. But here we're just showing how we can, very easily represent a conceptual migration strategy, which is again the whole idea of the EA project, showing that, well, based on how we're going to get to that target architecture, we have to get to this in 2 phases, representing those as work packages, and then a set of solution delivery projects that are brought to bear to drive towards the realization of that target architecture. And just to be sensitive to time, want to take a look at the architecture definition document. So again, the ability to use the RTF report generator to extract all this content for stakeholder review. So that's, again, I've gone a little bit over, Scott. My apologies to you and the members of the audience. So I'll throw it back to you to kind of finish this up.
No worries. Thank you very much, Chris. We certainly had a large number of questions, and it was an excellent presentation with a great level of detail. We probably won't be able to get as many questions in as I'd usually like, but I'll just throw a few your way, Chris. The first one, Gilliam said, is the APG model downloadable? So I'll hand that over to you.
Yes, so basically what you're seeing here we will make available in some form. We will likely not have all of the content in it, but the overall model structure that you're seeing is something that we're going to package up and put up on the community site hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. I have another question from Andrea said, if I'd like to describe our business architecture using TOGAF, how should I do that? Which enterprise architect means and diagrams and views should I use?
Well, obviously there's a number of industry standards that are pertinent to bring to bear. A couple that I mentioned, SBVR, BPMN, but those are again languages for expressing some of the details of the semantics. If we go back to the TOGAF architecture content metamodel, TOGAF says that more than likely the kinds of things that we want to keep track of are organization units, actors, roles, functions, capabilities, services, all that kind of stuff. But our recommendation is that before you jump into modeling just because we can, we really want to take that step back, as you may remember from this diagram. I'm not sure if people can still see it. The idea that do people need to understand, functions, services, products, relationships between data entities and business functions. So we really find that in order to stay true to the mission, you really want to go out, identify your stakeholders, understand their concerns, and use that as a focal point into determining which elements you want to model in Enterprise Architect and how. Out of the box, again, we can use BPMN diagrams, business rule diagrams, domain diagrams, and of course there's the TOGAF MDG add-in that has, again, an out-of-the-box implementation of the TOGAF architecture content metamodel. So there's a couple places to start. If you want to get very specific about particularly capturing certain kinds of relationships and metadata about your business architecture, then that's usually where APG recommends that you create a custom UML profile, perhaps extending the TOGAF implementation that Sparx provides to deliver something that's